Recently, there's been a lot of policy interest in so-called soda taxes, and in the US, several cities have started implementing such taxes, and quite a few other cities are thinking about whether to pass such taxes, and if they pass them, how to exactly implement them, how high to set the tax rate, over which geographic area to levy the tax, and which products should exactly fall under the tax. And so we were interested in using data from one of the cities that already implemented such a tax in order to understand exactly how that tax affected consumers, whether it improved nutritional intake, whether it was able to raise tax revenue, and to use those findings to then guide our thinking about how to design soda taxes going forward. In our study, we're using data from Philadelphia, which is the first largest city that implemented such a soda tax, and it provides us with very detailed information across many products and a large set of stores, starting from convenience stores to supermarkets to wholesale clubs. And we observe both the prices and the quantities that were purchased of sugar-sweetened beverages before and after the tax went into effect. Philadelphia, in our mind, was a particularly useful test bed to look at the effects of soda taxes and think about what effect soda taxes might have in other localities. So far, researchers have mainly used data from Berkeley, where the first soda tax was introduced, in order to study the effects of such a tax. But Berkeley is a relatively small place, relatively homogeneous, and so it's a bit of a question to what extent those findings would extrapolate to other settings. Philadelphia, instead, is much closer to the US average in terms of its demographic profile, in terms of its obesity rate, and it's also a quite heterogeneous and diverse city, so it allows us to study how consumers in different neighborhoods with different income profiles and different obesity rates might react to the tax. This tax was 1.5 cents per ounce, so on the typical 2-liter bottle of Coke, the price would increase from about $1.50 to $2.50. So that's a very substantial increase in prices. Now, the tax was levied not on retailers directly, but on distributors. So first thing to study is whether the price increase was actually passed through to consumers. And we find that the answer to that question is yes. It is essentially a 100% pass-through rate. We find that quantity purchased in stores in Philadelphia drops quite dramatically, by about 46% on average, with sometimes even larger decreases in supermarkets and somewhat smaller decreases in convenience stores that tend to sell smaller pack sizes of goods. We study in particular two adjustment margins. We looked at, do people switch to untaxed beverages? And there's really two classes of beverages here. People could switch to bottled water, or they could switch to natural juices, which aren't taxed, because they have no artificial sweetener added to them. Interestingly, we find there's almost no change in demand for bottled water, so there doesn't seem to be any substitution towards those products. And there's some modest amount of substitution towards natural juices, which are presumably healthier along other dimensions, but they're actually still quite high in sugar and calories. So it doesn't improve things along that dimension. And then finally, and this is maybe the most interesting and striking finding that we didn't necessarily anticipate, is that we see a large amount of what we call cross-shopping. A lot of consumers drive outside of the city in order to buy the same beverages at stores that aren't in the taxed area. Now, it's important to bear in mind that Philadelphia is still a relatively small area. So you're never more than 4 miles away from the city border, so it's maybe just quite easy to engage in that type of cross-shopping. And so about half of the decrease that we see in stores in Philadelphia is compensated by a corresponding increase in stores up to 6 miles outside of the city border. Interestingly, what we find is that stores that are located in lower income areas, there's actually less of a response to the price increase. And this was something that initially was very surprising to us, because you would think that lower income households tend to be more price sensitive. Now, one possible explanation for that is that low-income households have less access to transport, so it's harder for them to cross-shop at stores outside of the city, and hence they can't react on that particular adjustment margin. And so what happens is that they simply continue buying the product at the higher price, whereas richer households drive outside of the city to buy their soda at those stores where the tax does not apply. The fact that so many consumers decided to drive outside of the city to buy sugar-sweetened beverages is a discouraging fact along a few different dimensions. So what this large amount of cross-shopping means is that we don't get an improvement in nutritional intake because consumers continue to buy the same products. It leads to lower tax revenue because purchases outside of the city aren't taxed, and it inconveniences consumers in the process. So regardless of whether you're aiming at improving consumers' nutritional intake or you're trying to raise tax revenue that you can use for other purposes in the city, the cross-shopping makes it harder to achieve both of those goals. Depending on the policy goal you have, whether you want to improve nutritional intake or simply raise tax revenue, you might adjust policy levers a little bit differently. If you want to raise tax revenue, you want to make it very difficult for consumers to avoid the tax. So what you want to do is to tax a broad geographic area and to have a broad product coverage, so it's difficult for consumers to substitute to any other product in either geographic or product space. If instead you're trying to improve nutritional intake, you want to make it hard for consumers to avoid the tax geographically, but you actually do want them specifically to substitute towards different products, in particular healthier ones. And so if you're trying to improve nutritional intake, my suggestion would be to tax a broader geographic area, but tax a more narrow range of products that actually allows consumers to substitute towards relatively healthier products